What is up? Today we're back out at my local nature center, and I just kind of wanted to do a video explaining camera basics, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and what they do, how you can use them to get certain images, and the things to avoid. It is a beautiful day out today, I think. Clouds all over, the light is very even. There's not much wind. Aperture is basically how open your lens is. Inside each lens there's a diaphragm that has a small opening or a wide opening. The smaller the number for your aperture, the wider the opening. The wider the opening, the faster your lens is. How fast your lens is means how much light can come in at one moment. The wider your aperture, the wider your opening, the more light is coming in at one time. So what I'm talking about is that ring back there. See how it's opening and closing? So here's the shot we have set up, and I'm gonna focus on this piece right here. I believe on most cameras there's a little button down here that'll show you what your aperture looks like. That's how I got this to do this. It'll give you a preview of what your aperture looks like. You can see on here, maybe, hopefully, how it changes the focus of the background. The wider your aperture, the smaller your focal plane is. The more closed your aperture is, the wider your focal plane is, the longer your focal plane is. So every time you close your aperture a little more and go down a stop and increase the number of the aperture, for instance 2.8 to 4.5, you let in a little less light. The more experienced you become, the more you can use aperture to get certain effects on photos. Some of those effects include bokeh, creating soft images, creating sharp images, getting moving objects to blur purposefully, such as water or a car or clouds, whatever. And that can also lead to things you need to avoid. If you're shooting a landscape, you don't want to use a wide open aperture such as 2.8, because then the whole scene won't be in focus. If you want to separate your subject from the background, then you want the bokeh, you want the wide open aperture. Smaller apertures can create chromatic aberration, which are little lines of color around objects, mostly from between light and dark objects, such as the sky and a building or trees. Another thing that can happen is diffraction. And so now I'm just going to take some photos and I'll show them here. So this photo was taken at f2.8, and you can see the great bokeh that the wide aperture produces. All back here it's nice and out of focus. However, with such a wide open aperture, it has a very small depth of field, as you can see down here, where it begins to go out of focus very quickly. At f6.3, the bokeh isn't as desirable, but it still separates the subject from the background efficiently. You can see at 6.3, it begins to lose focus less drastically and has a larger depth of field. Right down here. At f2.8, it loses focus right about here, and at 6.3 it starts to lose focus about right here. As we close our aperture, the depth of field gets larger and objects in the background become more in focus, as seen on this photo taken at f11. Everything in the background is a little more in focus, but our depth of field is larger. As we can see down here, it starts to lose focus right around here. At f22, the focal plane becomes even larger and objects are much more in focus. Here is a good example of using an aperture that is appropriate to the photo. As you can see, the bark on the tree is just as in focus as the other parts of the foreground, while still being separated from the background. The only area that it begins to lose focus on the foreground is right here in the bottom left corner. If we take a look at a wider shot, you can see why using a smaller aperture is useful for landscapes. This photo at f2.8 has almost nothing in focus. The point of focus, which is this metal right here in the center of the photo, is pretty much the only thing that's in focus, along with the leaves right here. The foreground closer to the camera is totally out of focus. It just doesn't look good. At f14, the focal plane has extended to include our foreground and most of our subject, losing focus at the furthest part of the metal object and losing all focus in the background. The focus point on this photo was the metal in the center. If we focused on the trees in the background, our foreground would be completely out of focus and potentially we would lose focus on the subject. Looking at this tree bark at f2.8, you can see that the center of the tree is nice and in focus, but it starts to lose focus as the tree rounds out since our depth of field is so small. The background is entirely out of focus, creating some beautiful bokeh. At f11, the majority of the tree bark is in focus. However, the bokeh is not very desirable. We only start to lose focus at the very edge of the tree bark. At f22, the spots that lost focus at f11 are now rather sharp. However, the background is not very separated from the subject because it is now closer to being in focus because of the increased depth of field. Alright, so I want to use this photo to show a few things. First thing is that if we take the same photo or the same subject from the same point, the tripod and camera are at the same point, but if we widen the angle, the background appears to be more in focus. This is why cell phones can take a picture at f2.8 and the whole scene looks good because they use very wide angle lenses. The next thing I wanted to show was an example of chromatic aberration. So what chromatic aberration is basically the waves of light of different colors aren't able to focus on the same point of your sensor. And you can see here the red and the green. And this happens all the time. And Lightroom does a pretty good job of removing it automatically. So we can see here. Boom. On and off. It's pretty good. So chromatic aberration basically happens when waves of light are unable to focus at the same point. So I want to give an example also of diffraction. So the photo on the left is taken at f22 and the photo on the right is taken at f11. I don't know the exact science behind it, but basically diffraction is when light has to curve around the opening of your aperture. And what this does is it makes for a not as sharp image. And if you can see on f22 compared to f11 at the same point, the f22 one does not look as sharp as the f11 one at all. It's not really noticeable like this, but when you're pixel peeping, you can definitely see it. So that's what diffraction is. The light is curving around the aperture opening, and it causes it to not be as sharp in the details. So there's a lot to learn about aperture. To keep it simple, the wider your aperture is, the more light you're letting in at once, but the smaller your focal plane is. The smaller your aperture is, you're letting in less light, but the greater your depth of field is. If you are taking photos of people or a subject that you want to separate the background from the subject, use a wide aperture. If you're photographing a landscape, use a smaller aperture. But I wouldn't go above f11, f14, because then diffraction starts to happen, whole bunch of jazz. Basically what ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor. The term comes from film, how sensitive the film was, but because of digital, it gets transferred, blah, 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 technology, capitalism. A higher ISO means that your sensor is going to be much more sensitive to light. A lower ISO means that you're going to have a much less sensitive sensor. So I'm just going to take a shot of what's behind me to show you what to avoid with ISO. I'm going to keep the aperture the same at 7.1 and just change the shutter speed to appropriately expose the image. Alright, let's get into this. So, there's a lot of speculation on what causes noise, and we are not going to get into that today. All I know is that from my experience, and a lot of other photographers' experience, the higher the ISO, the more noise tends to show. So this photo was taken at 12,800 ISO, and if we zoom in, we can see all these tiny little dots. That is noise. You can see it really well in the frame, of the door, and you can see it really well in the sheet metal over here. If we look at the same photo taken at ISO 100, you can tell that there's basically no noise, especially in the shadows. They look really good. Even the sheet metal looks really good. If we go up to ISO 800, you can see just a little bit poking through, a little more here on the frame, and just a teeny tiny bit on the sheet metal. You can kind of get away with the sheet metal though because of the texture. The same photo taken at ISO 3200 shows a lot of noise compared to ISO 100 and even ISO 800 in my opinion. So the higher the ISO, the more noise is going to show. I don't care what anybody says. When shooting landscapes, I always try to use the lowest ISO possible, depending on the situation, of course, and it allows for no noise. Makes a nice, crisp image. A time that I do use a higher ISO is shooting handheld. I try not to keep it above 800 though, because on my camera at least, above 800 it starts to get really noisy. But the reason I use a higher ISO shooting handheld is because I can use a faster shutter speed to try to capture the motion. Handheld because you can prevent handshake blur, because your hands do shake. So shutter speed is really straightforward. It is how long your sensor is exposed to light, how long your camera is actually taking a picture, how long your shutter is open. You can use shutter speed to blur motion, to freeze motion, or in between. Some things to avoid with shutter speed is on a windy day, don't use a very slow shutter speed or even really a slower shutter speed, because all of your trees are gonna blur because they're moving. Use a faster shutter speed. Also, when using a fast shutter speed, make sure you have enough light coming in and that your ISO is high enough. So to demonstrate, I'm right next to the highway. I'm gonna use cars because they're moving, and we're gonna show you what a fast shutter speed versus a slow shutter speed does. All right, so we've got our shot set up here. Here we are with the photos. This one was taken at ISO 1600 and f2.8 with a shutter speed of 1/2500th of a second. The ISO and the f-stop are to let in as much light as possible so we can use that fast shutter speed. If we look at the car, you can see a bunch of noise. It's gonna take a lot to convince me that ISO does not affect noise. This car should be traveling at about 55 miles an hour or 88 kilometers an hour for everyone else. America needs to get with it. And we can see that the motion was captured very well. The only thing that's a little bit blurry is the tires, because, you know, the tires are rotating really quickly. But everything else is pretty frozen in time, if you want to say. And it looks pretty good for capturing the motion. If we look at our long exposure of 0.8 of a second, you can see that the speeding car has blurred its motion in the photo. This is because the shutter was open and the sensor was exposed long enough for the light reflected off the car to pass through our whole frame. Alright, so this photo was taken at 1/20th of a second, which is somewhere in between our fast exposure and our long exposure. And what I really like about this photo is that it shows what's going on very easily. You can tell that it's a speeding car, and it looks pretty neato. Can't see the tire very well. That's pretty cool in my eyes. But basically, since we're in that nice middle point, it doesn't expose as long, but it doesn't freeze the motion. I'm gonna try to do another explanation of, or just example really, of shutter speed. And what we're gonna do is try to get down there safely so we can get that water. Here we go. Too fast, too furious. Filters help with this, but you don't have to have a filter to do it. You just gotta have the right light and the right settings. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna shoot the moving water with a slow shutter speed to try to get it to be nice and smooth. You'll see a lot of photos of waterfalls. I don't have any waterfalls around here, so we're just gonna do our best with this. Risk it for the biscuit. I'm gonna actually set my tripod in the water too. Ooh, a frog. Somehow I got out here. I'm like in the middle of the river. It's really shallow right here. So we're all set up. Here's our shot. The water's not moving super fast, so I need to use a longer shutter speed to create that motion. I know it's not gonna focus, but you can kind of see it. I'll put it up here. And we're gonna try to get this water to be nice and smooth. All right, so I'm just gonna run through these photos real quick because this video is getting kind of long. So I just took one here to show you what it looks like without blurring the motion. And then here's the motion blurred at 8 seconds, f20, and ISO 50 to try to let in as little light as possible at once. And I think this is a super cool method. You can do a lot with this. This is just, you know, a basic river, and look, you can see all underneath everything. And these little ripples are really cool. Got a few other ones here. And I really like the way the colors come out of the water. You wouldn't see it if the water is moving. And I love the way this rock looks in this one, and the color here. And then we've got this really cool leaf back here. So this is just something you can do with water. You can really try to get your long exposures down. This one's at 15 seconds. It's a really cool method. Here's that last scene. Well, it's starting to get dark, and it's way too cloudy for any cool colors in the sky today. So I'm gonna start heading back. As always, leave it better than you found it. Pick up your trash, get out and explore, get out and shoot. In the middle of a river. Ridiculous. Oh, hey, look, more trash. Oh, and guess what I found? Goldfish. A snack that smiles back, except when you litter. So hopefully you were able to learn something from this. I was able to teach you something, hopefully. That's my main goal, is I just want to share what I know. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.